So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So we'll have now our third session on this international workshop on cities and its migrants. And the third session is about ethnic trade between cultural isolation and desirable diversity, the ambivalences of ethnic trade. Ambivalences in terms of the vision or the image we have about ethnic trade. On one hand, ethnic trade creating jobs and help economic integration, as we have seen in a way this morning, and on the other hand, for instance, it's considered as a marker of self-segregation and thus damaging social and political integration, for instance. To talk about this very key issue, we'll have two speakers this afternoon. First, Jan Rath. Yeah. It's a good way to, it's a good pronunciation, I don't know. From the University of Amsterdam and the Institute for Social Science Research, and it will be followed by Antoine Pécoud from the University of Paris 13th. So, I will give you the floor.
Okay, good. I prefer to walk around when I speak.
So that's fine.
There's only one problem. I have two hands. So I have paper and a pointer and this, so, but we'll see how I manage. Not. Before taking you to Chinatown in Amsterdam, there's something else that I would like to show you. I'm professor of urban sociology in the University of Amsterdam, but I'm also the European co-chair of this organization, Metropolis. And Metropolis has existed for over 20 years, and the aim is to bring together experts in the field of migration and migrant integration all over the world. And we want people from the academia who do research, who produce knowledge. We're interested in having people from a policy background or from NGOs. And the idea is that Metropolis constitutes a platform to exchange ideas, so as to encourage the development of evidence-based policies on the one hand, and on the other hand to encourage researchers to not just produce work that's understandable by other people, but publish it in a way that is understandable and useful for users. And it so happens that this year, in September, the conference will take place in The Hague. And you can sign up for it. If you're not entirely sure, but you want to stay posted about what Metropolis is doing, then you can sign up to this Facebook group. And every day, say on average, there are 20, 30, sometimes 40 messages related to migration. And that could be, say, Syrian refugees stuck in Lesbos, or the plight of migrants today in the US, or the situation in French, German, Dutch, Swedish cities. So it's all inclusive. You all got it there. So anyway, so much for my self-marketing. There are various ways to think about the interrelationship of ethnic diversity and economic prosperity. You mentioned jobs, that's one way. You can talk about businesses. There are all sorts of ways in which you can envisage how migration, diversity, and the economy is connected. Earlier this morning, we talked about the Chicago School. At least there were some references to the Chicago School. And the Chicago School sociologist had a particular connection in mind. And I'm perhaps a bit overstating this, but what they basically said boiled down to this, that once migrants have settled, they will gradually get used to the mainstream way of doing things. They will assimilate culturally. And that social and cultural assimilation coincides with spatial mobility, and that coincides with upward social mobility. So in their view, there is a clear connection between sort of getting rid of your cultural background and economic prosperity. And although I'm inclined to think that this could be true on the long run, we're talking about 4 or 5 generations, but on the short run things are much more complicated than that. And to show this, I started a project a number of years ago into a very specific case, namely the self-employment of immigrants who do not become part of the mainstream, or at least who demonstrate in their way of doing things, in their everyday business making, that it's not really necessary to adopt mainstream ways of doing things. It's not necessary to become spatially dispersed, but that in being together, being spatially concentrated, there are economic opportunities. And in the Netherlands, this was seen as something that was not possible. I mean, politically, that is. So the political idea is that we need to help these folks to integrate as soon as possible and let them become spatially dispersed, and then the, say, upward social mobility and a harmonious society will automatically comes out of the magician's high hat. Anyway, the idea to study this is not really innovative. If you go to Canada, the US, Australia, to say the classic countries of migration, you will easily hit upon many, say, ethnic precincts, ethnic neighborhoods that are very much characterized and also popular because there is a concentration of ethnic businesses. This pic was taken in Chinatown in Manhattan. I have to admit it was taken on a day on which a movie was being shot. So that's why you see all those red balloons. Normally you wouldn't have that here, but it adds up to the exotic attraction of this neighborhood. But this is a neighborhood that has existed for many years, like the Chinatowns in Boston and San Francisco, a neighborhood that for a very long time was seen as unwelcome, not good. It's actually a stain on the skin of the city. But it has existed for a long time, and it has offered multiple opportunities, both for entrepreneurs and for workers. Some people are very critical about that, including an American sociologist, Peter Kwong. Peter passed away the other day. That's why I forgot him, actually. But I found a message that he passed away. But he was very critical. He would say, well, the workers who are working are being exploited. And he is probably right. But I'm very simplistic. I think to have a lousy job is better than to have no job. This is not to say that we need to have more lousy jobs. But it's basically to underline that for a number of people who have no alternatives, this could be a stepping stone towards a better place in the world. You are the expert, because most of you come from Paris, but I've learned that there's also a quartier Chinois, a Chinatown here in Paris. You know much more about it, so I don't dare to say anything about it. And there is one coming up in Amsterdam. In a few Dutch cities, Amsterdam, Rotterdam, The Hague, you can see the contours of a Chinatown. And I want to take you to Chinatown and in so doing show you the complications of developing such a way of being economically active. And now this is my first problem because I only have 2 hands. Let me just continue with showing you pics. This is a map of Amsterdam. That is downtown Amsterdam. I'm sure most of you have ever been to Amsterdam. In the heart of the city, this is the canal area with a famous heritage architecture. And somewhere in the middle, close to Central Station, here, Central Station is here, and there's a meandering dike. A dike used to be there to protect the land from the water. So it's slightly elevated. You may hardly notice it, but it still exists. This has become what become known as the Amsterdam Chinatown area. It stops here at Newmarket. There's Gelderse Kade, and also some of the streets here are part of it. It's very small compared to the Chinatowns in, say, San Francisco or Melbourne. It's nothing. But compared to any other shopping area in the Netherlands, it is something. It definitely has an Asian flavor, as you can see here. It has, you see the Asian flavor by all the signage that the shops have, the type of shops, the people who walk around. Here is, well, this is one of my favorite pictures, although the quality is not entirely good. But it shows the old destination of this house, this business premise. There used to be a wine distillery, and now there is a Chinese restaurant, Nam K. To be sure, this street has existed for 300-400 years. So most of the buildings have that age. So in that sense, it's very old. The Chinese presence, to be sure, is not that old. The restaurants, there is here, this is acupuncture. So if you need an acupuncturist treatment, you can stop by, or if you think that a good batch of herbs is enough, you can also get it here. There are these smellscapes, so when you walk there, you can smell the roasted duck or anything else, and that adds up to the attraction of the neighborhood. Some of the shops, not many of them, but some of the shops have adjusted the facade. They've added up say these pagoda-like roofing styles, and that too adds up to the Asian character of the area. There was an empty space here, and a few years ago, a number of people decided to build a temple, a Buddhist temple. The temple was opened by Queen Beatrix, who was the queen then, and the next day the builder got bankrupt. There's no causal relationship there, but still, it's fun. It's a funny idea. There's a lot of Taiwanese capital in it, and I once visited with a Taiwanese student, and she felt very embarrassed. She said, "This is so ugly." But she's probably the only one who noticed that, because many visitors, including visitors from the Netherlands, from the US, from Germany, they think that this tells us that this is not an average shopping area. It's clearly Chinese, Asian, exotic, whatever it may be. Here, two restaurants. This restaurant became very, very well known nationally. Because first of all, there was a guy who wrote a book, the Oysters of Nam K, the Oysters of Nam K, that was located in that restaurant. The owners had no idea that this guy wrote this book, but they were very pleased with the gift that they got. And later, there was a movie being produced based on the book, partly shot in the restaurant, and the owners were in cloud nine. In the literature about self-employment and businesses, there's a lot of fuss about business plans, and you need to have strategies, and if you don't have those strategies, you're not bankable, and then you will never be able to become successful. Anyway, this shows that contingencies, just a sheer coincidence, being lucky, can also be a good way to make businesses strong. So what we have is a shopping street with a relatively high number of Asian shops, not all Asian. There are also shops from Thailand, from Suriname, but together they are seen as part of the Asian flavor. It's not just shops, there are also community organizations. There was the temple, there are health facilities around the corner. And for those who are interested in learning more about it, you can go to the internet, sign up for a tour, and then you get a 1.5 hour walking through the area. Same here. So in that sense, at least in the virtual world, this Chinatown exists. Well, let's have a look at the literature. The classical literature about these ethnic neighborhoods, these ethnic precincts, about the commodification of ethnic identity, if we may call it as such. Most of the literature, to be sure, that comes from the United States. They have a very particular take on these developments. So they would see this as the development of an enclave. And there's an ethnic enclave. The enclave serves as a migration hub. So some people move out, but through migration, new people enter the area, and they strengthen the ethnic character. It's a site of urban marginality. There's a huge Chinatown in San Francisco. It has been there for more than a century. In 1906, there was the famous earthquake and followed by fire, and the Chinese area was destroyed. And the newspapers, they were, well, exalted about it. It's good. The Chinese neighborhood is gone. Because they thought a Chinese neighborhood is full of vice, it's full of crime, it should not belong in the city. But it was nonetheless rebuilt, and now it's among the top 3 of tourist destinations in the same city. So things can change. But anyway, it started as an area of urban marginality. In terms of the social structure, the way it looks, is often described as a transplantation of home. And anyway, a spatial manifestation of ethnic identity. It's sort of how ethnic networks, ethnic relations, connections, ethnic trait comes together in a very small part of the city. And more theoretically, these authors, these American authors, they describe this area as a stepping stone towards an assimilationist trajectory or a multicultural trajectory. But anyway, they set this in an ethnic group framework. It's part of ethnic group development. Okay, well, let's go back to Amsterdam. Amsterdam is not a migration hub. I mean, there's a lot of migration, but the Amsterdam's Chinatown is not fed by migration for a very simple reason. The Netherlands, like many other European countries, pursue a restrictive immigration policy. So when these Chinese restaurants want to recruit a new chef from Hong Kong or from wherever in China, they don't get permission to do so. The government just says, there are enough unemployed people in the country, so you just train them, irrespective of their ethnic background. So even an unemployed German or Dutch, they could also learn how to produce chow mein. So that's what you do. So it's not a migration hub. It's not a residential enclave in a marginal area. First, if you look at the statistics of Chinese coming from mainland China, from Thailand, from Hong Kong and Amsterdam, they are remarkably well dispersed. There is not one single neighborhood in which you would find a peak. They are quite dispersed. And that also holds for the Chinatown area. So Chinatown is not a residential enclave. Secondly, it's not marginal. It's in the heart of the city. It's in the heart of the canal area. It's unbelievably expensive. And because of that, you won't find a concentration of marginalized people in that area. Also, it's not a place where Chineseness, however described, is self-evident. Everything that I just showed is the result of continuing negotiation. It's not a transplantation of home. So we need to look for other cues to understand what's happening. And I'm inclined to think that it doesn't suffice to look at ethnic characteristics. You need to place it in a political and economic context. So what we are seeing is basically a shopping area. It's a shopping mall. It's a concentration of a number of shops that happen to be started, happen to be set up by Chinese, and that is being read, considered, understood as a Chinatown. And so what we need to do is to look at cues for, say, business development. And unlike, say, those who are very much intrigued by neoclassical economics, I tend to think that it's not just supply and demand. It's not just, say, the free market conditions that determine, but there's also regulation, because each economy, and that also includes the liberal economy of the US, is regulated. And regulation is related to paying taxes, health inspections, planning rules, zoning rules, well, the immigration rules. So the example that I just give shows how the government, by making decisions, impact opportunities in Chinatown. Even though when the government took those decisions, about migration, they never thought about a Chinatown. But the very fact that it happened has an implication for what happens there. So it's a themed shopping area in which we find business people, entrepreneurs. And entrepreneurs, they compete. They want to get a share of the market. And they also have understood, at least some of them, not all of them, but some of them, that when they are together, coming from, well, or say, being associated with more or less the same ethnic markers, that it could make sense to market that, to brand that. But that branding is not self-evident. It becomes part of a further, well, negotiation or struggle with the wider environment. Chinatown in Amsterdam, located close to Central Station, in the heart of the canal area, is also a site of gentrification. And that gentrification is not a coincidence. It's very much steered by the local state for an interesting reason. Adjacent to the Chinatown area is the red light district, prostitution, a wonderful tourist destination, to be sure, but also an area where trafficking abounds, where say exploitation is rife, and the city wants to deal with that. And they are in the process of cracking down on prostitution. Although prostitution in the Netherlands is legal, they want to crack it down so as to confine all sorts of criminal activities, and also to pave the way for a different type of urban landscape. So what the city has in mind is a nice middle-class boutique landscape, as Sharon Zucken would call it. A boutique landscape with design clothing, coffee bars, and so on and so forth. So that's the area that we're talking about. The local government and housing associations who own a lot of the property and have the power to influence what's happening there, they play a key role. So it's not just entrepreneurs competing with each other, it's also entrepreneurs who are competing with each other and struggling with the powers that be at the same time. And this is not a level playing field. So regulation matters in all sorts of ways. So this area in the past, say 100 years, has always been a location of entrepreneur activity, but on a very modest scale. So in the 1930s, it was about the sale of peanut cookies or ties. It was peddling, it was street trade. Later, in the 1970s, a new type of migrants came to the Netherlands, coming from the Caribbean country of Suriname, and they sort of chose the Zeedijk and what's now the Chinatown area as their turf. And they did what they would have done in the capital of Suriname, Paramaribo. They were just loitering around. They would walk in this way, as if they were the masters of the street. I took this from the internet. I find this an amazing picture, because who is the powerful here? Who is the dominant? These guys, they were just, maybe they lived somewhere else, but they walked around as if they would own the place. And these guys, they don't like it. What happened simultaneously, well, come back to that, is that in the 1970s, all sorts of drugs were being introduced in Amsterdam. And the drug trade, the street trade, was concentrated in the same area. So what is the Chinatown area became an area of crime, of serious crime. Decent people would not be walking around because they really faced the risk of being mugged. And it took a while before the local government stepped in. But they did. And that happened in the 1990s. And the local government did it because there was a hotel willing to invest on one condition, namely that the city would clean out the area. And that's what happened. The city, in collaboration with Housing Association and a few other partners, they set up the NV Zeedijk, which is a public-private partnership, and they were assigned the task, with a lot of money, to clean the area, to renovate the area. And that's what they did. So they re-landscaped the area. There was much more policing, CCTV. They refurbished the houses. They cleaned up the shops, refurbished them, and rented them out very carefully to kosher renters. Here's CCTV. And this is how it looks now. It looks very neat. There is the drug addicts disappeared. Of course, it's in the heart of the tourist area, so there are always people who are looking for ways to get illegal money. But it's very much controlled. It's a safe space. It's a very nice space. What happened is that not so much middle-class boutiques gravitated to that area, but just Chinese. And I've always wondered what accounts for that. And I think there's only one reason. Because in the mindset of a lot of people, Zeedijk was still dangerous, although the police was in control. And Chinese, they just thought, it's a wonderful business opportunity. We'll rent the place and we start a restaurant or, well, kitchen utensils or that cat or what have you. So very quickly, this area transformed into an Asian area, an area with an Asian flavor. You know, I'm very careful to use the word Chinese, although Chinese are dominant here, because other Asian ethnicities are involved as well. The Chinese business community, and I need to be very fast, the Chinese business community very quickly decided what we are doing here is a Chinatown. And so we are on a par with New York and San Francisco and Vancouver and Toronto, but it doesn't look like a Chinatown. Of course, yes, we have the shops, but we want to get subsidies for a gate and a parades. And so they really want to be acknowledged. And they really want this area to be named Chinatown with all the jazz that comes with that. And they did not succeed. So now we are 20, 25 years later, they did not succeed. I mean, the only success were street signs in Chinese characters. So where is it? No. Well, here. 30 centimeters of acknowledgement. But anyway, they had to engage in negotiations with the authorities. And the negotiations, they revolved around 4 items. So the city said, well, you want to have a gate, but this is heritage architecture. I mean, these premises have existed for 300-400 years old. We're not going to mess with that. So we're not going to support a gate. Or they said the Chinese wanted to have a parking structure because a lot of visitors would come from outside the city. Impossible in Amsterdam. Amsterdam is a green city. They only want to promote cycling. Impossible. Then the city said, well, but if we would acknowledge Chinatown, more people will gravitate to that area. And we don't want that because it's already overcrowded. They were also suspicious about the business performances of these Chinese. And the business performance was seen as poor because we're dealing with ethnic entrepreneurs after all. And also the long-term effects, they were very much concerned about that. So that was another reason not to support it. There was also the fear, maybe one more minute, there was also the fear that if the city would support this, then for sure the Turks will claim the same. And then the Moroccans will claim the same. And that would be a contradiction to the integration policy of the local government. They just didn't want it. And thirdly, why would we support Chinese? Because there's so many other groups involved in the city. So they basically denied the right of the Chinese business people to claim that part, to claim part of that identity. And in so doing, they prioritize other. And in the course of time, because in the beginning, the first factors dominated, but increasingly, it's this, a bit of combination with that dominated the discussion. And in order to understand that, we need to go back to this 1012. That's a zip code, to be sure. The 12,000 project. And what it basically said, this is part of a document that the city authorities read. They said, well, there is a Chinatown and Chinese businesses have contributed to the redevelopment, which is wonderful, and we support that wholeheartedly, but there are too many shops that do not deliver the quality that we expect. Nowhere in this document you will find any definition or operationalization. It's just common sense, a common sense notion about quality. So what they basically do is said, okay, we will support Chineseness, but in a very light way, in a sanitized way, and only for as far as it contributes to the development of a boutique-style shopping landscape. And that's what you have now. So what we basically see is a Chinatown that sort of is acknowledged, but more in words than in deeds, and a Chinatown that's only allowed space for as far as it contributes to a gentrified shopping landscape. And that's all I wanted to say. Exactly within 20 minutes, was I? All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. I will now call to the floor Antoine Baku, who is, I don't know if you are a professor or whatever, in sociology at the University of Paris 13. So you have about, as before, 20 minutes for your presentation.
So, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for inviting me here. I'm very glad to speak right after Jan Rath. Actually, last time I met Jan Rath was in my jury de thèse, Viva committee, as you call it in the UK. Please confirm. Yes, and so I think we share a lot of, background, academically speaking. We have both been working on ethnic business, ethnic enclaves, but I think in doing so, we both read a lot of North American stuff, studies by key American sociologists on the topic of ethnicity, integration, urban diversity, ethnic enclaves. And at the same time, we actually felt that much of this literature was unable to capture what's going on in Europe simply because the context is very different. But on the other hand, that's the mainstream sort of dominant paradigm in social sciences. And probably one of the key things we've been doing, at least both of us, is struggling to sort of adapt some of the key concepts we use with the reality we work on. So I have two hands, but I don't have a paper, so it's easier. Is that, how does it work? Is this here? Okay, great. So basically my paper is much less pictures, unfortunately, much more quotes and text. The key question I want to address is basically very simple. Why do we speak of ethnic economies? And analytically, how do we decide that an economy is ethnic? Obviously, when we see the pictures of the Chinatown in Amsterdam or anywhere else in the world, it's pretty obvious. We see the sign, the shop, the kind of products, the people who walk around, and we say, oh, this is ethnic. This is fairly sort of common sense, and most people would probably, go away with that. But I guess, one of the key things in social sciences is just to question sort of even the most basic assumptions. So, ethnic economies, fair enough, but why and when, and because of what factors do we decide that an economy is ethnic, or correspondingly, that an economy is non-ethnic, and how do we approach non-ethnic or sort of mainstream economies from the perspective of ethnic economies? By definition, if you assume that there are ethnic economies, it means that there are also non-ethnic economies which are very often left implicit. Very few people speak of the white economy, for example, even though you could easily argue that most of the economy is actually a white economy. So these are some of the key questions I want to address. Just recalling the literature here, as Jan was already mentioning, it's a huge field of study. In a literature review, which are already more than 10 years old, they counted 1,700 publications on the topic, which is really a huge amount of production. It goes all the way back to the Chicago School, at least. but it's really burgeoning in the 60s, 70s, 80s, especially in the North American context, and to a lesser extent also in Great Britain. There's a textbook on the topic published already, almost 20 years ago, and so it's really something that you can do your entire career working on ethnic economies, and everybody seems to assume that this exists and that it's worth being studied, which is probably the case, but nevertheless sometimes you can question the field itself. That's basically what I want to do. I know it sounds a little pretentious, but nevertheless I think it's worth at least trying to discuss the topic. So the term ethnic comes back all the time in literature. People talk about ethnic enclaves, ethnic niches, ethnic economies, ethnic resources, and if you look at the key books published on this topic, again the word ethnic comes back over and over again. I guess, if you're an anthropologist, I'm an anthropologist by training, the word ethnic is problematic. For other disciplines, it's perhaps less problematic, but nevertheless, when you see all this reliance on the concept, you can't help thinking, well, let's question the concept itself, or to what extent is it solid enough to what extent is it based on, a real sort of, empirical analysis of what these economies are all about. So basically, structured representation, anyway, it's not really useful. I probably won't talk about my own case study of Turkish entrepreneurship in Berlin. It's too old anyway, and I probably won't have the time. Basically, what we'll try to do is mainly the first point is to look, as a paper I did a few years ago, I went through many, perhaps not all the 1,700 publications, but many of them, and I tried to look at definitions. How do the authors define their topic, and when and how do they define the very idea of an ethnic economy, and what kind of factors do they introduce in the definition. So basically that's the first point here, and this is basically what I try to do. So the question again is, what is ethnic economy? How do we connect the question of ethnicity with the question of entrepreneurship? And I'm going to give 8 examples from the literature. Some are by well-known authors, other by much less well-known authors, but nevertheless, they're all from published work on the topic, all in English, and they all try to basically define what an ethnic economy is, and the point is that there are many different types of definitions that circulate, and that are worth, I think, being disentangled. So the first one is a very well-known book, key publication in the history of this scholarship, and it says basically, it's quite cautious. It say, well, it's just a set of connections, interactions among people. Some people happen to share a common national background, they write, or my common migration experience, and they end up being sort of loosely connected, interacting in the course of the business. So that's why it's ethnic. It's basically because some people with a kind of shared background do interact from time to time. It's a very loose definition, if you think about it. Sociologically speaking, it's quite weak. Because you don't, it's not a strong definition, but at least it recognizes that, to some extent, it's a matter of network. It's a matter of social interactions between people who are thought to share something, to have something in common, which is a common national background, as they say. They come from a specific other country, they are migrants, or migration experience. They've all migrated. The second definition, again from a very, very influential authors, is very different. It says basically an economy is ethnic when ethnicity is good for the business. So basically it defines an ethnic economy by the advantage of ethnicity. So we'll see later on what the advantage of ethnicity is, but that's a key point. The idea is that if you're ethnic but you don't benefit from the fact that you're ethnic, then you're not an ethnic economy, to put it simply. It's a bit of an awkward definition because it posits that the economy is succeeding, it's prospering, it's prosperous, and it believes and assumes that one of the reasons why an ethnic business is growing and developing is because people rely on ethnicity. And I'll come back to this idea of ethnicity as a business asset or business advantage. Okay, for the first 2 definitions. Third one is Ivan Light, another very influential author. He says basically, self-employed employers, co-ethnic employees, unpaid family workers. This is the ethnic economy. It's composed of people, and the people are the shop owners, actually the person who owns the migrant or the immigrant descendants who owns the shop. the employers, the people, the self-employed, the employers, the employees, and the unpaid family workers. And this, we go back to what Jan just said. He argues that indeed many people say, well, look at those ethnic economies. It looks nice, but actually people are really badly exploited. And indeed, we could add that a major source of exploitation is a kind of gender exploitation with unpaid family workers, usually women, working for their husband who is the shop owner and usually working for nothing, for no salary. So this is basically a very descriptive definition. That's what an economy is. Ethnic economy is. It's composed of those different group of people. Fourth definition is also about people, participants in ethnic enterprises, but as you can read, it's also about co-ethnic customers and potential employees. So basically, we sort of go back to the idea that ethnicity is an advantage. If the assumption is if you want an economy to prosper, you need customers, you need people who work for you and who buy your products. And for this, you need ethnic people around you, so to say. So ethnic economy is not only the people who basically manage the shop, but also all the people who surround the shop, including the customers and the people who are sort of around and who could work for the shop, or at least who are available as in terms of labor force for the viability of ethnic enterprises, as they say. And another definition from the textbook I already mentioned, a very short one, ethnic because the personal are co-ethnics. So again, the idea of a network, the idea of a connection of people who are similar in one way or another. People are co-ethnics, the employers, the employees, the shop owner, the people who work in the shop, they come from the same country. So because of that, the economy is ethnic. The sixth definition says exactly the same thing, but differently, so exactly the opposite, sorry. Same ethnic group, but they may have employees from other communities. So that's a key issue we'll come back to. Who is working with whom? And that's a very sort of labor sociology question. Who owns the shop? Who works for the shop owner? And how did the interaction develop? And actually, there's a huge body of empirical evidence that shows that ethnic entrepreneurs do not have co-ethnic employees. They have sometimes other employees coming from other groups, less well-off groups. When I was working in Berlin, for example, you had lots of Turkish migrants or descendants of Turkish migrants who had shops, and they would employ irregular African migrants, for example, very cheap labor force, because their own sort of co-ethnic labor force was too expensive. So this is something that is pretty important here, the ethnic relationship between employers and employees, which is tricky because you assume that in the economy, sort of the community works with, with each other. All people come from the same community, but ethnicity can play the other way around by actually fostering inter-ethnic exploitation between people of different ethnic groups. And then the seventh definition is more standard sort of definition of ethnicity, speaking of self-identification or identification, meaning that we refer to these people as ethnic. This is a well-known sort of Frederick Barth kind of approach to ethnicity. Basically, ethnicity is a social construction, and you are ethnic if I consider that you are ethnic, and if many other people consider that you are ethnic. Basically, it's a way of arguing that ethnicity doesn't really exist in and of itself, but it exists because people believe it exists, and because it structures social life, and it's a sort of social sort of construction. And the last one, long one, it's interesting. It's a kind of Bavarian definition here, because it posits that those people, it's the end of the definition, there's a cultural heritage. There's this idea that individual behavior is constrained into a specific culture. So here, obviously, the Bavarian sort of Protestant ethic is in the back of the mind of all the researchers. This idea that specific economic configuration can be traced back to a specific culture, specific way of looking at things, specific identity. And because of this sort of cultural root, then you have a specific kind of economy that emerges. And this is actually applies a lot in popular understanding to Chinese entrepreneurship. People say, well, Chinese people, they work hard, they're well organized, they are sort of, they are sort of predestined to become business owners. Very Bavarian argument arguing that some cultures are good for business, others are not as good for business. And this pertains a lot of the academic, but mostly also policy literature on this topic. Which group do well? Which group manage to become business owners? And if there's no difference between these groups in terms of social status and migration experience and so on, then can we assume that somehow culture makes a difference? And this definition really posits that somehow people in ethnic economies are different. They are different because they are sort of rooted in specific networks, specific culture, and therefore they are actually, they display a different way of doing business because of the otherness, so to say. Very much culturalistic also argument. So I know it was a little quick, but maybe we can try to go back to these definitions and see, the key aspects that emerge. So basically, we have this idea that an ethnic business is ethnic because the shop owner or the people inside the ethnic business belong to an ethnic group. And then you can list all sorts of ethnic groups depending on the country, and you can assume, like definition 7 does, that ethnic group is a social construct. It's not something that exists objectively. It's constructed through history of migration, history of the society, of the receiving society. And at some point, you do have identified ethnic groups that exist, and then those people coming from this group who open a business, well, then they are ethnic business people. So it's fairly simple. You look at who the people in the business are. If you believe, and if the society around you believes that those people are from a specific minority group, then it's an ethnic shop. Because those people are Chinese, you can actually see it. They speak a foreign language, they look different, they have different products. It's basically a shop that pertains to an ethnic minority. Obviously, minority is never an objective concept because you may have, German entrepreneurs in France. No one really believes they are German entrepreneurs. They are just entrepreneurs. So, it's a matter of socially constructing difference, otherness, and so on. But then the other definitions stress the fact that people belong to the same group. So here, it's a kind of embeddedness argument. Marc Granovetter, his well-known work on the embeddedness of economic activities in social networks. The idea being that what makes this ethnic economy is that it's different from the others because the people in the group share more than the fact they all belong to the ethnic economy. It's this idea that they work together, but they don't only work together. They also belong to another group, to the same group. So they have pre-existing sort of non-commercial, non-economic ties that bind them to each other. And therefore, the key thing is to look at the business and look where the people come from. If they all come from the same group, if they know each other, and they socialize outside the business because they belong to the same minority, if, for example, they go to the same Buddhist temple every week, then it's an ethnic economy. Because indeed, the people are sort of bound to each other in a specific way that is sort of different from the kind of abstract, cold, so to say, impersonal way of doing business that would characterize the mainstream economy. So you would have a kind of sort of more substantial social ties between people, precisely because even when they leave the business, they still socialize and they are still sort of members of the same group. So here, the question is, whom do you include? As I said, you can assume that your employees and employees come from the same group. So Chinese business people would recruit Chinese or employees of Chinese origin. But it doesn't really work. So the question is, who actually do you include? Do you include also the employees, also the customers? If Chinese shop only caters to non-Chinese customers, is it still Chinese? So the question is the definition. How many people, how many kind of people do you include in this sort of community flavor of the business? So here, the idea is really the shared belonging of the people inside the business. Not really the fact that they belong to a self-identified or well-identified ethnic group, but the fact that they are embedded into a specific community, which would change the way they do business. There are a lot of arguments on the fact that if you work with people from the same group, you cannot cheat, for example, because you need to keep your reputation in the social group. And if you cheat your partners, your business partners, then you will be stigmatized, ostracized, not only in business life, but also in everyday life. You won't be able to marry your daughter in the community, for example, because you've been cheating and you sort of have bad reputation in the group. So the assumption is that because there's this non-economic ties between people, they will behave economically in a different way. They cannot do business in the same impersonal way that characterize the kind of sort of mainstream dominant industrial economy. Obviously, it's a very old debate. If you go back to Karl Marx would argue that the industrial economy is a kind of anonymous economy in which sort of capitalism and the quest for profits sort of destroy all the pre-existing local flavor, local culture. And typically at his time, the Jewish way of doing business was a kind of local way, community way, cultural specific way of doing business, and this way to be destroyed by the spread of a kind of very sort of universal, abstract, cold quest for profit that sort of destroys the social and the deep cultural ties that exist between people. To some extent, people frame ethnic business as a kind of going back to their old ways of doing business, in which some people speak of business on trust. You trust your partner not because you have signed a contract, but because you both belong to the same group, and you know that somehow you're connected to this person because he knows your uncle from the same village and so on, and somehow you can trust the people. But again, in the US, we have lots of studies that show that Asian entrepreneurs have Latino workers. They may not be immediately visible. If you go to a restaurant, there might be a difference between the people who come and bring you the food and those who clean the dishes in the kitchen. These may not come from the same ethnic group, so the ethnic flavor can actually be sort of constructed, but it can be multi-ethnic. So you could argue that if you go to an Asian restaurant, but you don't see the Latino workers because he or she is hidden in the kitchen, nevertheless he or she is there. So what is it? Is it a multi-ethnic economy, an ethnic economy? It's not clear. Nobody really agrees on that. Now, what do you do with these people? What do you do with these sort of local people who are non-ethnic but who are inside the ethnic economy? So maybe you can wonder, in this Chinese economy in Amsterdam, who's actually working in these shops? Are they all Asian? What actually happens? And I met a lot of Turkish business people in Germany who would say, well, if you want to have a nice restaurant in Berlin, you need a pretty German student to serve the drinks. That's what you need. You don't need a Turkish co-worker. For the back room, for the kitchen, well, why not? You can have a Kurdish refugee who has no right to work and easy to exploit. But when it comes to the forefront of the terrace of the bar, then you need nice people who speak German, who are able to interact with everybody, and so on. So, who is working for whom is a key issue, and you have lots of different patterns, and which are difficult to place in the ethnic economy definition. How long do I have? 6 minutes, great. So here, I guess the term ethnic here is deeply ambivalent, because we can use it in two ways, descriptive versus analytical. We can use it as a way of saying, well, they are different from the mainstream, somehow, they are ethnic. But we can use it to say, well, because they are different, they work differently. The business interactions, the way the economy will develop is different. It's different because it's embedded in a different culture. And if you're an anthropologist or a sociologist, you believe that indeed networks and culture have an impact on the economy or regulations, like Jan said, but also the values of people, the social and cultural ties that bring people together. This has an impact on the business. And therefore, an ethnic business will be fundamentally different from a non-ethnic business, simply because people are different. Culturally speaking, they are rooted in different culture, and because they work with people they know, they work with people they have deep ties with, then because of that, they will function in a different way. For example, there are lots of studies who work on informality, arguing that informality, or for example, rotative credit associations, when you borrow money from other people, from your minority, these are typically features of ethnic communities which rely on a shared belonging to a minority group. And because of this shared belonging, you can have access to different ways of doing business. And you can actually argue that ethnicity makes the economy different. And it's a very strong sort of sociological statement because you assume that the rules that apply to a normal, quote-unquote, business do not apply to an ethnic business. There are different rules because the people themselves are different. Obviously, you should apply this to non-immigrant groups. You should apply this to people, for example, in, I don't know, the bank system, for example. They all come from the same higher education institutions. They share lots of practices. They go and they play, I don't know, tennis or golf the weekend together. So somehow they socialize, they are socialized, and this also makes a difference on the way business is done. But somehow, it's one of those things with migration studies, you tend to consider migrants as the object of study and not compare what they have in common with non-immigrants. Nevertheless, from a basic economic sociology perspective, the fact that values or culture or networks have an impact on business or on the economy is true for everybody. It's true for all possible patterns of economic life, not only for immigrants' patterns of economic life. So here again, the difference is nature between ethnic and non-ethnic business. And here we go back to something we saw in one of the first definitions, this idea that ethnicity is useful, is an advantage. And this sort of really deep topic in the literature on ethnic economies, which tend to share the assumption that somehow immigrants have made it because they were members of an ethnic group. So this argument can take many forms. You can, list a number of things already mentioned, what people call often ethnic resources, the fact that because you're a member of a group, you have resources that non-members do not have access to, trust, the reduction of transaction costs. You trust your partner, so there's less transaction costs, sharing information, access to skills, to information, to partners, and so on. So you also have the transnational dimension of this argument, arguing that it's very good if you have a diaspora, for example, if you have Turkish immigrants in Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, France, and so on, then somehow you have a network of people whom you can trust, and this facilitates the transnational expansion of your business. So actually, the diaspora would be a very precious asset in a globalizing economy because it would actually create a kind of transnational network in which you can develop your business. So this is a key argument in literature. So we see that the definition, the term ethnic business, is actually very sort of loaded. It's loaded with this idea very often that because you're ethnic, you're different, and that because you're different, you actually make it, commercially speaking. It actually posits that being a member of minority will translate into a business advantage. Obviously, most of the time you can define ethnicity as a kind of social capital. To put it very simply, it's a network. It's the idea that having networks is crucial to succeed, a very basic idea. And ethnicity would provide networks for people who lack everything else. So this is a very common argument. Immigrant entrepreneurs, they don't have really skills. They don't know much. They haven't been to schools. They haven't been trained. They don't have the right skills. They don't have money. And banks will not really trust them. They won't give them the money because they don't think they're going to make it. So they have very little resources. But nevertheless, because of ethnicity, because of social networks, because of social capital, they actually overcome the underprivileged class position, which is their own condition before they start the business. So here, what Jan already mentioned, arguing that, well, that's one side of the picture, and Jan stressed the other side of the picture, which is basically regulation, the context, the institutional context. The idea that, well, you can have resources, but in the model, you need these resources to fit the context in which you're working. And sometimes regulation can be much more determinant in terms of explaining business expansion than ethnicity, as he showed. So indeed, you can question the ethnicity argument, and I guess that's perhaps one of the key differences between sort of North American and European context. North American context is probably more characterized, to put it very simply, by a kind of laissez-faire, in which basically people have to, can do whatever they want as long as they make it. I mean, that's fine. Whereas the European context, of course, you have to be very prudent with the argument. But nevertheless, the key idea would be that the European context is much more regulated in terms, for example, of training. if you go to Germany, if you want to open a bakery, for example, you need a specific Ausbildung, what they call, a qualification as a baker. For this, you need to go to school, then you need to be picked up to do an apprenticeship in a bakery, all sorts of things that very often immigrants don't manage to do. So they are actually constrained because of the institutional regulation, whereas they wouldn't be constrained the same way in a much more deregulated, laissez-faire economy. So class, key issue, obviously, arguing that economists, when they work on ethnic business, they say, well, no way, it's not going to work, because those people have no human capital and no financial capital, so there's no way you can make it if you don't have this. So sociologists argue, well, no, they have social capital, and they have this ethnic embeddedness, which they can actually use to overcome the deficit in human and financial capital. And so you have endless studies in the American literature in which they try to compare immigrants. They look at immigrants in the business sector and the same immigrants who are employed, who are not self-employed, who are not entrepreneurs, and they try to compare who earns more. And if the people in the business earn more, then they say, look, it means that ethnicity, social networks make a difference. But economists say, no, they don't earn more, they earn the same, so it means that basically it's class fundamentally that makes the difference. Class is the key explanatory variable. And perhaps going back to the Chicago School, we always go back to Chicago School in these debates, especially in the US. Basically, if you follow this idea that ethnicity is an advantage, then, to put it very simply, you'd better not integrate. It's very simple, because the more you remain in your group, the more you have the specific social networks that are specific to your group. So this is what Alejandro Portes called segmented assimilation, to put it simply. It's a counterintuitive term, but nevertheless it refers to the fact that you better stick to your group, even if you're the children of immigrants, and even if, according to Chicago School's idea, you should integrate in the mainstream society, in the mainstream economy. But today you should not do that, because if you do that, then you'll really sort of integrate, you'll assimilate, as they say in the US, but you assimilate in the worst sort of underclass of the American society. And this is really bad, because then you lack everything, financial capital, human capital, but also the social capital. So the group actually protects you from a very brutal economy, brutal society, in which you can actually rely on nobody but your own group to make it. So basically, basic groupism, strangely enough, if you look at the apology of migration, I'll stop on this, people tend to be extremely skeptical with categories. They say, well, we'll never work on a specific groups. They never say, for example, we'll work on Chinese minority culture, because that's kind of reification of minority culture. Anthropologists are extremely skeptical about this type of approaches. But somehow, this groupism, as some people have called it, exists a lot in economic sociology, and we tend to assume that we can talk about the Chinatown, for example. And we, in many other contexts, we wouldn't speak about Chinese immigrants, about Chinese culture, about Chinese social life. We would say this is, sort of reducting people to a single dimension of their identity. Identity much more complex. They borrow, they are hybrid people with hyphenated identities, and so on. But somehow, when we go back to ethnic economies, and this is perhaps the sort of the puzzle that's initiated my research in the first place, we go back to a very sort of, group-centric approach, in which there will be a Cuban economy, an Italian economy, Latino economy, or whatever, a Chinese economy, and so on. So I'll stop here. Thanks a lot for the extra minute, and let's perhaps discuss. I was very happy to follow up with Jan had exactly the kind of introduction I would have wished for. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Jan and Antoine, for these two presentations. I must say that your papers were for me very useful these two past years, because I was involved with my colleague Lucien Endelstein in a program comparing different neighborhoods in Paris. African neighborhood, Japanese neighborhood, Chinese neighborhood, and so on. This research was focused on food shops, and restaurants and food shops. And it was funded, by the way, by the Paris City Hall, which is interesting because there is clearly some kind of need of expertise on these topics. And we were clearly confronted very harshly to the difficulty of categorization of these shops and these very harsh question of what is ethnic in what do we do with ethnicity? Is it useful? Is it do we have to set this concept apart to focus on more empirical observation? So it's of course very difficult, and especially when we try to make a cartography and mapping of these shops, because you have to categorize them. And when we do field works in these topics, we are confronted with uncategorizable, I don't know if the term is right, of some shops with different layers of cultural references, kosher Chinese restaurants or stuff like that. So it was very useful to have this work on definitions. My first point or question is a question from a geographer. It means that all this ethnic economy, what does it create in terms of urban landscape and commercial landscape in the city? So you talk about the different types of consumers, but are there mostly inhabitants of the neighborhood, or do they make long distance trips to reach this area? Are these streets seen favorably or negatively by the both inhabitants and policymakers? So, and more widely, how do these commercial dynamics articulate with urban change in general, and especially in the central part of the big cities, in the gentrified neighborhoods? Because you talk, Jan, about, of course, commodification of exotism, commodification of this alterity, but how does it actually works in terms of urban landscape? Second question is, how do local policies deal with these issues? Because, of course, at a very local scale or small scale of action, we see that through parking and car traffic management, through health control, through, I don't know, accessibility for disabled people and so on, there is a possibility, a room maneuver to orient these shop activities. But do you have any idea of maybe a larger scale action and policy regulation of these commercial activities? And in Paris, for instance, we have this idea for maybe 10 years of the Marché des 5 continents, which is a big commercial complex designed to welcome, to host these former African shops. So what do the politics do with these commercial issues? And the third maybe question is that we see many change in terms of customers' habits and the taste for exotism, and the way all these products spread in the distribution, not only in these ethnic enclave, but in other kind of shops. So what does it create, and is there a difference between maybe some neighborhoods in very central area of these big metropolises. Your Chinatown in Amsterdam is very central place, and maybe some other parts of the big cities, more suburban areas, where this question of ethnic shops, ethnic trade has quite different economic stake, and it works maybe differently. So these are the three questions for the moment, and maybe we can go further after that. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Where to start? Okay, so there were three questions. One is about the commercial landscape. So who are the consumers? Well, there is a sort of a common sense idea that when you have a Turkish shop, that the consumers are Turkish and that they go there out of a sort of ethnic loyalty. And in a sense, it's true, and it's not true at the same time. But you see increasingly, because certainly in the Netherlands, that most of these Turkish businesses or Moroccan businesses or whatever other businesses are located in mixed areas. An ethnic-only area, say that is dominated by one group, doesn't exist. So they automatically cater to multiple people. And to give you an example, and that creates interesting, say, economic spaces. So I live in a town, I don't live in Amsterdam. For somebody who originally comes from Rotterdam, that's too much a big step. But in my town, there is one Moroccan greengrocer, and it's clear that he's Moroccan, the staff is very Moroccan, his son is working in the shop, family labor. There's another guy who is always around, who is not employed, but who is with his winter coat, he is sort of drinking a coffee in the back. And when it's busy, he suddenly climbs behind the counter and he is servicing the cashier. Very unclear. When there's a Moroccan, they speak Arabic. When there's somebody else, they say hi. And it's actually a microcosmos of the entire town. And that I find interesting, because it shows that on the one hand, you see elements in the, say, the daily operation that you could connect to say, the category of Moroccans, and I'm sure there's some traditional elements in it, but at the same time, the same entrepreneur is catering to people from other ethnic groups, and that's a smart strategy, because if he would just cater to Moroccans, the market would be way too small. And it's clear in an attempt to branch out. So and of course, if you look at specific, say if you compare a number of ethnic businesses, if the term ethnic business is correct, but let's use it for the time being, then you see a lot of variations on this theme. And of course you can wonder if somebody sells cell phones or vegetables, what's so specifically Turkish or Moroccan or Surinamese about that? I don't see the difference. In fact, it are the same cell phones and the same oranges. So at best it's the style, it's how to say that, the way of selling stuff, the price. So the usual things that always matter. Why do you go to that place? Well, I like that entrepreneur better. He is always cranky, so I prefer that one. It's the same sort of things that apply. Related to that, well, there is a couple of questions that you had about local policies and how the entrepreneurs are seen. Well, if you would go to any local politician in the Netherlands, they would say it's wonderful. It's these people, they are self-employed, they create their own work, maybe they create jobs for others. It's very important, and we appreciate diversity. So they pay lip service to the contributions. But if you look closer, and especially when it comes to making decisions about re-landscaping shopping streets or revitalizing neighborhoods, then you get a different type of discourse. And then suddenly ethnic or say real or alleged ethnic, is seen as another word of bad, of unqualified, of poor. So somebody who is, say, a Moroccan fishmonger is a bad fishmonger. He tries to be a successful entrepreneur, he tries to play the game, but he's not capable to do it. So, and I think in the case of Chinatown that I just tried to explain to you, you see that very clearly. So a regular, not hippish, but a regular Chinese restaurant is seen as a bad restaurant without further qualification. But it's, and of course it has to be a bad restaurant because it's Chinese. And that is very difficult to accept for a lot of these entrepreneurs. And it's and this is especially clear in those neighborhoods where the local government and other actors try to boost their local economy. You saw it in Chinatown. In another neighborhood, the same is happening, gentrifying, the share of social houses is being reduced. They are refurbished and sold to middle-class people. New type of shop enters, there come coffee bars, a bookstore, restaurants, and so on and so forth. Design clothing, design lighting, and so on and so forth. And in that period when this took place, there was a Moroccan guy. He wanted to set up a coffee bar, not a coffee shop, a coffee bar. So not selling marijuana, but espresso and latte macchiato and the whole shebang. And he knew that subsidies were available. So he called the city district applying for subsidies. But the civil servant at the other end said, oh, he's a Moroccan guy, we don't want that. And he was a bit puzzled, so he called again and again. But to no avail, he was refused. Then he asked his wife to make the same phone call. His wife is Dutch. And she was immediately invited to come to the city hall because she was sort of seen as somebody, this is another cultural entrepreneur who will contribute to the revitalization of the local retail street. And I think this is telling. This is, it's embarrassing too, but it's telling that ethnic businesses have such a low status and that it's associated with everything that's bad. Too many ethnic businesses is a sign of deterioration. And the only ethnic businesses that are good are the ones who sort of play the middle class game. I think I've covered most of the things. Can you read it?
So yes, thanks for the questions. The space dimension, it's very tricky if you look at the studies. I mean, some people say, well, first people live in the country, in a neighborhood, so they have specific needs, and because of that, there's a protected market, so to say, and there's a business that opens in the neighborhood where the potential customers live. So the first thing is basically residential distribution, and where people live, there's a market, and if you have I don't know, if you have a neighborhood with lots of Moroccan people, logically enough, you will need a Moroccan shop to provide the Moroccan services and products that are needed. So perhaps that's a kind of typical historical way this has developed. And indeed, if you look at Little Italy in New York, historically it was both places where Italians would live and would do business. The two would come hand in hand. But as Jan was saying today, I mean, we hardly see anything like this. The real sort of the traditional ghetto, so to say, no longer really exists. I mean, if it has ever existed in Europe. So we have much more diverse neighborhoods. And indeed, what you see also, and perhaps what is worth adding, is that today, if you want, I don't know, kasher food or Italian food, you go to the Monoprix or to any other supermarket, you'll get them. So obviously, the ethnic businesses no longer have ethnic customers simply because it's much cheaper to go to the supermarket and to have basically more or less the same kind of products. So obviously they have to open up and they have to cater to other customers which may actually look for the exotic flavor of food or stuff like that. So I think the connection now is very loose, and actually I had a lot of, when I was doing field work, a lot of Turkish shops in Turkish neighborhoods in Berlin, but the shop owners were living very far away. They would do half an hour subway to actually come to their neighborhood and start working there. And this is actually typical for the gentrification process. If you can afford it, you move out of the sort of impoverished immigrant neighborhood because it's much better for your kids and for the schools and for everything. But to some extent, your networks, professionally speaking, are still in another neighborhood. So somehow you're torn in between the two. So this is, I think, pretty tricky issue. And indeed, you can imagine today, I guess perhaps Chinatown is the case, that actually you invent a kind of ethnic neighborhood in a place where no specific ethnic immigrants have ever lived. So you actually make it up. It's a complete commodification. It's a complete sort of construction from a sort of top-down process, so to say, to some extent. So I don't know if it applies, but you can imagine this because this sort of disconnection, complete disconnection between where people live and where people open their shops. In terms of public policy, honestly, I think there's not much. I mean, I've rarely seen sort of specific targeted measures. As you say, I think many policymakers in the EU or in different EU countries, in principle, they're in favor of that. When unemployed young immigrants open up their business, why not? It's a good thing. It's basically a good thing, and it's much broader than immigration. If you go to EU strategies, promoting self-employment is a strategy to fight unemployment for the entire population, not only for immigrant youth. Obviously, immigrant youth is particularly disadvantaged overall, and so they are the target of those policies. But it's a very general policy that, fostering employment, self-employment, fostering business creation as a strategy to fight unemployment. When I was doing fieldwork in Berlin, what I had also is the idea that ethnic business people are kind of an ally for their city in terms of cleaning the neighborhood. Put it very simply, if you have a business, you don't want to have like people who sell drugs or prostitutes all around your shop, because this will put off customers. So you need a clean street, to put it simply. And so it's a good way of fostering a healthy city is a way of promoting small businesses, and the owners of those small businesses, they are interested in cleaning up the city. So you had this. And also, I think what you had is, in terms really of, there's a nice famous book, by American sociologist Mary Waters called Ethnic Options, or Optional Ethnicity. The idea that you can put forward your ethnic dimension, or you can neglect it, or you can sort of underplay it. And when I was talking to those Turkish business people in Berlin, they said, well, when I go to tax people, I don't say I'm a Turkish business people, because they would say, well, no, we have to check that you're not cheating and so on. When I go to the bank, I don't say that I'm a Turkish business owner, because they won't give me a loan. But when I go to the city mayor, or to the city, the mairie, then I say, well, I'm an example of successful integration through business. And then they are very happy. They invite me to conferences. They give me, they symbolically reward what I'm doing. So I think this optional ethnicity is very important here, and it completely depends upon the local context. As far as I know, in many European cities, not much is being done. I think Paris, there's not much in terms of actually real interest in the topic. But when you have, it quickly leads to a kind of commodification, and quickly leads to a kind of business elite. You have a few sort of well-established business owners who actually are no longer ethnic. They have pretty big businesses, and they work with all sorts of people. They're kind of really mainstream. But somehow they can actually put forward the origin in order to say, oh, look how successful I am, and you can, if you want someone from the ethnic economy, just talk to me. I can represent the other people. And so the last point about, what the taste of the people, to put it simply, like the middle class, upper class people downtown, and the kind of impoverished people in the suburbs, and how their tastes are different and therefore have a different impact on the businesses. Yes, obviously it makes a huge difference, and here again, I think it's very much a class issue at the end, because indeed, there were a few sort of Turkish restaurants I remember that would open in the nice, rich neighborhoods, but these were by sort of often sort of elite Turkish immigrants, people who had done costly schools in the hospitality business, and they would open a nice restaurant and so on, and this would simply be too expensive for sort of normal immigrant entrepreneurs. So I think, at the end of the day, the class dimension is absolutely crucial to understand this, and we have to constantly crisscross sort of the ethnic diversity versus the class diversity, which are really two
two main ways of understanding this diversity. So I don't know if I answered the question, but no.
Thank you very much. No, I think that we're running late, so no, sorry, Jan, but you will be maybe able to answer some questions from the audience, because I don't want us to run too late. So whoever wants to ask some question, we'll have about 10-15 minutes maximum for the discussion to both speakers. If you want to make any supplementary comment, we'll be able to do that.
Please, come on. One question.
Thank you very much. My question was kind of following up on this, well, it might just be a comment, who knows, on this public policy dimension of things. And this might be very London specific, so apologies if I just pulled out something that's very unusual. So the part of London that I have done work on is an area in South London called Pécoud. Eric knows a lot about this, having spent some time there with me. But what seems to be happening there is that because of the cost of properties and rent, quite a lot of the kind of ethnic entrepreneurs sublet. And this means that in a space the size of your table, you might have 3 businesses. And one of the things that could adversely impact on that is new laws about subletting, which would then reduce the prospects for these small ethnic, in inverted commas, businesses. And at the same time, in that area, you have the development of a boutique infrastructure, which is also, in inverted commas, ethnic. It's a lot of second generation people who have maybe worked in banking, finance, law, who then decide to set up a Chinese restaurant or a Vietnamese restaurant or something like that. So you have these 2 very different approaches to understanding what it means to be an ethnic business ongoing in London. And I just wondered whether there were any kind of equivalences going on, because clearly that issue about subletting is not specifically targeted at the ethnic businesses, but will adversely affect on them. So, yeah.
We'll take some of the questions before asking the speakers to answer. No more questions?
Maybe this is rather a question for Hadrien, I don't know. I was wondering about Paris, because I think in the last 10 years, Paris has, and it's also about public policy issues actually, Paris has advertised itself as a multi-ethnic cosmopolitan city, and this is very new for Paris. I mean, and it has used ethnic neighborhood as a way to advertise this being cosmopolitan. So I was wondering, what is your feeling about this? Because my idea is that it's very interesting also to see how, and this is what you showed in your presentation, how ethnic business contributes to moral geographies of the city. So directly, of course, contributing to urban change and urban planning processes. And I live in a banlieue neighborhood, let's say, and it's exactly the contrary, which is happening. And like people are fighting, and it's a communist city, so you cannot say it's not really, like it should be immigrant friendly, but people are fighting against the kebab economy, which is considered as a problem because there are not anymore any local shops. So yes, I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on this. Thank you.
So please.
Okay. Subletting. Subletting as such, I hardly see it in the Netherlands. But I know that in the UK, the US too, it plays a role. What I learned from it is that we need to be very careful to talk about ethnic businesses and treat ethnic minorities as a coherent, say, monolithic category. because they are not. What we see, in fact, is actually a lot of reification of the concept. Yeah, I want to say more, but it takes too much time. Go ahead.
Yes, perhaps just about fighting the kebab. Yes, I have the same in my neighborhood, and it's actually something that you see in many neighborhoods, because indeed, to some extent, it's understood, as Jan was saying, as reducing the value of the neighborhood. And if you own a flat, you don't want the flat to be surrounded by ethnic businesses, because somehow this may put off people who will, when you want to buy your flat, it will reduce the cost, the price of your. So I think that's a pretty. You really have a kind of urban dilemma here, because on the one hand you want to employ some young people who otherwise may simply start selling drugs and creating lots of security problems, whatever. On the other hand, you want to have a neat city in which people can buy property and be happy and be, and the two, somehow clash. Perhaps not always, but at least some. And it's difficult what they can do. I live in the 12e arrondissement, and I'm surrounded, not exactly where I live, thanks God, but a few blocks away, there are lots of IT Chinese shops. There's a whole street, Rue Montgalais, for those who know it maybe, which only Chinese, there's at least 30 or 25, 30 Chinese shops selling second-hand IT equipment. And it's very popular. People come from all over Paris because you have cheap stuff, and people are very competent. If you go to a shop and you say, I want this, and they say, we don't have it, but go 2 shops away, they'll have it. So it's perfectly well organized. And when I was buying and selling flats, the guy told me, well, it's a bad thing, because be careful, your flat may lose its value if those Chinese shops sort of expand from this street and reach your neighborhood, which is 500 meters away, then you may lose the value of your property. It hasn't happened so far, so I reassure you. But nevertheless, it's actually tricky, and you see that it's very difficult to do anything, because at some point they wanted to avoid this in the city, but concentration, you cannot fight concentration itself. So because concentration happens in the best district also. For example, the mud district is entirely concentrated. So you cannot fight concentration per se, and it's very tricky in this sort of urban dilemma here. And on the other hand, they make a lot of money. So it's actually it's a prosperous niche. But obviously, there are losers and winners, as always. And indeed, it's an urban dilemma, which is understudied, I think, in Paris and in many other cities. I guess so. I think it's interesting, venue for research.
Well, you need to wonder. I mean, this concentration. Are we seeing a concentration of Chinese businesses or IT shops?
Yeah.
And it's an important distinction. And I'm inclined to say that none of these people set up a business because they had a need to expose their ethnic identity. They want to make money, the entrepreneurs. At the same time, you cannot say that it doesn't mean anything. But then you need to sort of pan out a bit. But we know that China, as an economy, is expanding enormously. And it's investing everywhere in the world. There is a guy in Rotterdam who has sort of studying how these money flows, and we're not talking about 2 cents. I mean, it's billions and billions of euro, how they flow around in the world and where these FDI land. And in Europe, it lands lots of places, but especially in London. And for the rest, it lands in places where you have a Chinese presence. And so in that sense, to have Chinese businesses in your city is good for FDI. You get Chinese investments because you can provide services that the folks over there like. So they can speak in their own language, they get the right food, the hotels, and so on and so forth. And that's a result that goes beyond the planning of a shopping street or, say, the ethnic relations in the neighborhood. This is something that operates at a global scale.
Thank you. We have time for maybe one more question.
Yes, hello. My name is Rufen. I'm from the organization International Urban Development Association. And I have especially a question for you, Jan. You just said it's good for a city to have like those themed neighborhoods like Chinatown, Little Italy, because it's promoting like capital flows. People have a basis where they live can on, and yeah, they can provide for their family, so small restaurants. But so, what would be your advice for a policymaker? Should we promote such neighborhoods or break down the communities?
Okay. It's very, very funny. When I introduced this project a few years ago to a group of people, including civil servants from the Home Office, they were appalled. Because they said, what you propose is against our integration policies. Because there's things happening we don't know. I mean, and apparently he was thinking about terrorism or whatsoever. Whereas I think the fear that concentrators of shop undermine integration basically tells me that those who have that fear have a very limited conception of integration. Integration is not just losing your identity and sort of evaporating into the mainstream. Integration is also being self-sufficient, being able to get your income independent of the state, being able to communicate with the powers that be, show, as you just said, your citizenship duties, contributing to the cleanliness and the safety of the street. Those are all citizenship qualities that matter for society as well. And if you do that, I think you're doing a terrific job. And what more can we expect? And besides, these folks send their children to university. So in the educational system, they are, or their offspring is successful as well. For the rest, well, how to say that politely? I don't care. But that may be the most honest answer. Whether there is a Chinatown or not a Chinatown, I don't care. Both are fine with me. What I resist, however, is an automatic resistance against the Chinatown. And so the reason why I was interested in studying this was a political one. I wanted to, well, I questioned the automatic resistance against ethnic concentrations and poor economic performance. But for the rest, in fact, I think even if the government would, no, one step back. The government should not promote it. I mean, it should be a business development. It shouldn't be. It's not a task of the state to create such, well, a zoo-like city. I mean, you can look at different beasts. But I think it's important that local, say the municipality creates conditions for businesses to thrive, irrespective whether they are concentrated or not, as long as they are not a nuisance to their neighbor, because that makes sense. But people who have just restaurants, that's fine, it's wonderful. And say a French, Chinese, Mexican restaurant in a row would be okay, and 3 Chinese restaurants would not be okay. I find that difficult to accept. In practice, what you will see is that this is just temporary. So if you go back to the US, I mean, that is in places where there is no continued inflow of new co-ethnics, like in New York. You will see that these ethnic precincts, they stop to exist. So in Manhattan or in Brooklyn, their Chinatowns have existed for a long time, and they seem to be relatively much alive. But there is a constant inflow of new people. In Washington, D.C., there's not. The Chinese who go to Washington, D.C., they jump right into the suburbs. So the Chinatown there is crumbling. In fact, it's history. It's just 3 restaurants and a gate. That's about it. And the same will happen to many of the other Chinatowns, unless they become tourist destinations. Then you get things like Little Italy in Sydney. There's not one single Italian living in Little Italy, Sydney. But it's a thematic shopping area. That's nice. In the same way as you have particular areas where you can buy cars or high-end clothing. So in Istanbul, there are neighborhoods where you can buy sort of customized made clothing. So, and it is not a neighborhood, well, not in Istanbul, but say in Amsterdam, you can get Chinese food. So if you see it in that sense, it relativizes a lot of the concerns and tensions that policymakers may have.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we stop here. We have a short break and come back in about 20 minutes. Thank you very much once again.